Alright guys, we're back talking about animal signals and communication. And of course animals don't have the complexity of communication that humans do, but you might be surprised sometimes at the complexity that they do show in their various modes of communication. In behavioral ecology we have what we call a signal. That's the behavior that causes a change in another animal's behavior. So that could be, say for example, a particular dance of a bird, or the call of a bird, or the waving of the claw of the fiddler crab, or something to that effect. And then we have communication. That's the transmission of the signal and the reception of the signal from one creature to another. A good example of this is in the picture that I have on the slide here. This is a male bowerbird. The dark sort of bluish black is the male here, and the male bowerbird goes through a very elaborate courtship ritual where he builds what we call a bower, a nest. You see it here. He builds this nest, and then he actually decorates it with brightly colored objects. They tend to really like blue. For some reason blue tends to be the object color of choice, and the females will actually inspect the bowers, the nests, and tend to choose their mates based on how elaborate the nest is and how colorful the objects are and how many of the colorful objects there are. So here we have a male bowerbird attempting to woo the mate, and you can see the female is right in here. She is not quite as brightly colored as the male is. And so the signal that we're talking about is the building of the nest and the collection of the various colored objects. You can see like a bottle cap and pieces of plastic and blue feathers. They will go and collect anything they can, especially that is blue, but of any brightly colored object. The communication is the transmission and the reception of the signal. So here the female is checking it out. She's deciding whether or not this guy is good enough for her. That's the communication side of this. So kind of like a call and response, a stimulus, and then of course the response to that stimulus. Animals communicate using a wide variety of various methods: visual, chemical, tactile, auditory signals. Of course, humans primarily rely on sound and words, or perhaps we have the more complex written language and that type of thing. But we also communicate using our eyes and touch and things of that nature as well. So we're not quite so far removed from the rest of the animal kingdom as some people like to think. A good example of this is in the fruit fly courtship dance that goes on when a male is basically trying to court and then reproduce, mate with a female. The fruit fly courtship follows a pretty distinct three-step stimulus response sort of chain, and it's a good example of what goes on in animal communication. So first, a male identifies a female of the same species and he orientates toward her. He faces her basically. There's chemical communication because he smells the various pheromones that the chemical female is releasing chemicals into the air. And then there's visual communication. He checks out the female. He kind of makes sure that she's of the same species. He orientates his body towards hers. Part two is that the male basically says hello. He alerts the female to his presence, and that's tactile communication. He taps the female with a foreleg, and that's like saying he notices her, and then he says, hey, how you doing? What's up? There's chemical communication also. He chemically confirms the female's identity in this part as well. And then part three, the male produces a little courtship song to inform the female of his species that he's there and he's wanting to mate. There's auditory communication. He extends and vibrates his wings in a certain pattern, and if all three steps are successful, the female will allow the male to copulate and mating will occur. This communication ritual is pretty clear and laid out and occurs pretty much every time fruit flies go through this whole mating courtship communication ritual. So we have the orientating, we have the tapping, we have the singing, and of course fruit flies are not humans, but if you wanted to create an analogy, this would be like he sees a pretty girl across the room, then he goes up and says, hello, how you doing, introduces himself, and then he tries to woo the girl in some way by taking her out to dinner or dancing with her or taking her to a movie, basically trying to talk her into, hey, I'm the guy for you, I'm good enough that you should be willing to mate with me or whatever, settle down, get married, have kids, etc. So this same sort of courtship ritual happens in these same steps with fruit flies, but of course different animals, different species have their own steps that they follow in this courtship communication ritual. A good example of a more complex communication with symbolic language occurs even in creatures that might surprise you. For example, insects. The honeybee is well known for having a fairly complex communication with symbolic language in showing the other bees where certain food sources are. So a foraging bee who returns back from the field, let's say he's found a beautiful patch of clover with lots of nectar and pollen for the other bees. Well, how does he communicate where that patch of clover is? When he comes back to the hive, he actually does that using a particular little dance. And this dance is a symbolic language that communicates how far away the food source is and the direction of the food source from the hive. So when the worker bee flies back to the hive, he actually has two different dances. If the food source is very close by, he'll do what's called a round dance. And the little round dance is basically he kind of forms kind of a figure eight and just kind of goes around in circles, wiggling his body as he goes. And that tells the bees, hey, the food is really close by. Just head out the hive and kind of look right around the hive and you'll find it. Now, if the food is fairly distant away, he has to tell the other bees in which direction to go, as well as give them an estimate of how far away it is. In this case, he does what's called a waggle dance, and the waggle dance has a couple of different complex steps to it that tell the other bees, okay, when I get out of the hive, which direction do I go, and about how far away should I travel. So the waggle dance is pretty complex because it tells the bee, based on the hive location and the location of the sun in the sky, when I leave, in which way do I need to head, and then, do I need to go fairly short distance or a far distance, and then they're going to use their other means of finding the food, like smell and that type of thing as well. So the bees have a fairly complex system for telling the other bees where they need to go. The round dance, the waggle dance, and that information is given to the bees via the little dance steps. Another way that animals often communicate with each other is using pheromones, chemical substances that are emitted by their body. So pheromones are odors or other various chemical components that they pick up on that are given off by the same animals of their species. There's a funny little cartoon here that says it's like a teenage bug of some kind. She's going out on the town, and the mom says, "Hold it right there, young lady. Before you go out, you take off some of that makeup and wash off that gallon of pheromones." So pheromones are oftentimes used in the animal kingdom, particularly among insects and even among plants. Plants even release certain pheromones as well to provide communication to other creatures. Lots of good examples in the insect kingdom. Female moth emits a certain pheromone that can attract male moths from several kilometers away. Honeybees, the honeybee queen, produces a pheromone that affects the development and behavior of female workers and male drones. And then even in, say, for example, a fish, if in a pond or an aquarium, when a minnow gets injured or a catfish gets injured, its body actually releases a chemical pheromone that will float throughout the water and basically kind of alarm or warn the other catfish or minnows in its presence. So what will happen is when this alarm pheromone or fear signal goes out, that will induce a particular response in the other fish in the area. Here's a picture of that. So here are the minnows before the alarm pheromone is released. They're just happily swimming around in the aquarium. They're kind of evenly spaced throughout. And if you take this chemical substance and you put that into the aquarium, they will dive down toward the bottom and huddle down toward the bottom and try to stay as still as they can. And this is a chemical, a pheromone, that can be taken from the minnow or from other varieties of fish that they actually release when they're injured or scared. The cool thing about pheromones is you don't have to have a lot of it. Many of these creatures are very sensitive and able to pick up small amounts of pheromones, so they're effective at very low concentrations. And then, of course, they're also very effective when you can't use other methods of communication or learning about your environment. Nocturnal animals, for example, that are mainly active at night, most terrestrial mammals depend on olfactory and auditory communication. So they use their nose and their ears a lot more than their eyes, and of course using their nose they pick up on a lot of these pheromone signals. Creatures that are pretty much more active in the daytime, diurnal creatures such as humans and most birds, well, they actually use more visual and auditory communication less nose, less olfactory communication. So if you are a creature who is around in the nighttime and can't really use your eyesight as one of your primary means of gathering information about the world, well, you're going to rely on your ability to smell, on your ability to pick up on pheromones, on these other methods of communication, whether that is verbal, auditory signaling, or chemical release, something like that. So the environment that you live in and the type of creature that you are will also affect the primary method of communication that you use. Let's take a break right there. When we come back, we're going to go on to our next concept that talks about the different links between experience and behavior. And we're going to talk about kind of learned behaviors and innate behaviors and more complex types of behaviors as we go up the line. So let's take a break. We'll be right back.